Here is a story about the fragility of safety. We often convince ourselves that the locks on our doors and the glass in our windows are barriers, but in truth, they are merely suggestions. This is what happened to Maya, alone in the velvet dark of a stormy night, the architect of silence. The rain in the Pacific Northwest doesn't just fall, it tries to get in. It was a relentless rhythmic drumming against the cedar siding of the A-frame cabin Maya had rented for the next 6 months. As a freelance copy editor, the isolation was the point. She needed to escape the noise of Chicago, the sirens, and the constant digital hum of a shared apartment. Here, 3 miles outside of a sleepy town in Washington state, the only network she had was a spotty Wi-Fi connection, and the ancient landline the rental agency insisted on keeping active. Maya sat cross-legged on the overstuffed beige sofa, the blue light of her MacBook illuminating her face in the darkened living room. The time was 11:42 p.m. The expansive floor-to-ceiling windows, which offered a breathtaking view of the pines during the day, were now just towering walls of obsidian blackness. Occasionally, a jagged fork of lightning would illuminate the swaying tree line, freezing the forest in a strobe light photo of violent motion before plunging everything back into the dark. She took a sip of lukewarm chamomile tea, her eyes scanning a manuscript about 19th century maritime disasters. The irony of reading about drowning while the world outside sounded like an ocean wasn't lost on her. She stretched, her spine cracking audibly in the quiet room. The house made sounds, to the groans of timber settling in the wet earth, the hiss of the radiator, the wind whistling through a microscopic gap in the window frame. Maya had been here 2 weeks. She had catalogued these sounds. She knew the refrigerator's hum and the way the third step on the staircase creaked without being touched. She was comfortable. She felt the heavy, wet blanket of solitude wrapped around her, safe in her bubble of electric light and dry heat. She typed a final sentence, hit save, and closed the laptop. The sudden absence of the screen's hum made the rain sound deafening. Then came the crash. It wasn't the sound of thunder. It was the distinct, wet slap of something heavy hitting the glass of the sliding back door, followed by a sharp, metallic screech like a knife being dragged down the pane. Maya froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stared at the black wall of glass, her breath caught in her throat. The room was dimly lit by a single floor lamp, making the reflection in the window a ghostly overlay of the living room. She couldn't see out. She could only see herself, wide-eyed and trembling, and the dark void behind her reflection. She waited. 5 seconds. 10. The wind howled, masking everything. Was it a branch? A bird blinded by the storm? She stood up, her legs feeling like jelly, and grabbed the heavy brass poker from the fireplace. "Hello?" she called out. Her voice sounded thin and pathetic against the roar of the storm. She approached the glass slowly, inch by inch, until her nose was almost touching the cold surface. She cupped her hands around her eyes to block the reflection and peered into the storm. A flash of lightning tore the sky open. For a split second, the backyard was illuminated in stark, blue-white relief. There was the deck. There were the thrashing pines. And there, rolling across the wooden planks of the deck, was a heavy plastic planter pot that had been blown over by the wind. It was rolling back and forth, hitting the glass. Thud, scrape, thud. Maya let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. She slumped against the wall, the adrenaline leaving her system so fast it made her dizzy. "Jesus, Maya," she whispered to herself. "It's just the wind. You're a city girl scared of a flower pot." She locked the poker back into its stand and shook her head. The terror that had gripped her moments ago now felt silly, a product of an overactive imagination, fueled by too many horror movies and too much isolation. She went to the kitchen, poured the cold tea down the sink, and decided to switch to wine. She turned on the radio to a low jazz station to drown out the storm. The normalcy returned. She was just a woman in a house, safe and sound. The door was deadbolted. The world was just wet and windy, not malicious. She spent the next hour tidying up, washing her face in the downstairs bathroom and prepping for bed. The fear had evaporated, replaced by a cozy drowsiness. The rolling planter outside continued to bump against the glass occasionally, but now it was a familiar rhythm, a known quantity. She wasn't afraid of it anymore. Maya turned off the downstairs lights, plunging the ground floor into darkness, and began to ascend the spiral staircase to the loft bedroom. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, a lullaby compared to the earlier violence. She reached the top of the stairs and walked to her bed, pulling back the duvet. She sat on the edge of the mattress, reaching for her phone to set the alarm. That's when she noticed the draft. A cold, wet breeze was drifting across her ankles. She frowned, looking toward the skylight. It was closed. She looked toward the bedroom window, latched tight. Confused, she stood up and walked to the railing of the loft, looking down into the pitch-black living room she had just vacated. The lightning flashed again, weaker this time, but bright enough to cast a long shadow across the living room floor. The sliding glass door, the one she had stared at, the one she had seen the planter hitting, was wide open. The wind wasn't blowing the door open. The door had been slid back into the wall. The rain was blowing in, soaking the carpet. Maya's blood turned to ice. She gripped the railing, her mind racing, trying to calculate how that was possible. She had checked the lock. She knew she had checked the lock. Unless she hadn't. Unless in her panic earlier, she had unlocked it to check the noise and forgot to engage the bolt again. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was that the door was open. And then she heard it. Not the wind, not the rain, but the squelch of a wet boot pressing into the carpet. Squelch. Squelch. The sound was coming from directly beneath the loft, in the blind spot where the stairs met the living room floor. Someone was inside. They had been inside since she went into the bathroom to wash her face. They had watched her turn off the lights. They had listened to her walk up the stairs. Maya backed away from the railing, her hand clamping over her mouth to stifle a scream. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling so violently she almost dropped it. No signal. The storm had knocked out the tower. She heard the first step of the spiral staircase creak. It was a slow, deliberate wait, then the second step. She looked around the loft frantically. There was nowhere to go. It was an open concept. The only way down was the stairs. The only way out was a window that was a 30-foot drop to the rocks below. The third step, the one she knew by heart, the one that never made a sound, remained silent. The intruder knew the house. They knew which steps to skip. Maya backed into the corner of the room, clutching a heavy ceramic lamp, her eyes fixed on the darkness at the top of the stairs. She waited for a face to emerge from the shadows, for a monster, for a ghost. But when the lightning flashed one last time, illuminating the top of the staircase, there was no one standing there. The stairs were empty. They hoped. She let out a tiny, broken whimper of confusion. She leaned forward, just an inch, trying to see down the spiral. A drop of water fell from the ceiling rafters above her and landed on her cheek. It wasn't rain. It was warm. Maya slowly, painfully, tilted her head back to look up at the dark wooden beams of the vaulted ceiling directly above her bed. And there, in the gloom, cling wrapped around the rafters like a spider, a man in a soaking wet raincoat was looking down at her, his face inches from hers, a finger pressed gently to his lips.